darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. May the words on our lips and the meditations upon our hearts be always pleasing in your sight, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. The kingdom of heaven is like this. Though every parable of Jesus begins with some variation of these words, some are more difficult to discern how exactly they reflect that kingdom. As puzzling as a parable comparing the kingdom to a mustard seed may be, at least we can instinctively intuit something about the kingdom from that image of a lush and even wild, uncontrollable growth from a tiny seed. Even if we don't fully understand it, we sense that it's good. Not sure what it is, but we know we want it. And then we come to parables like the one today, which ends once again with that very peculiar phrase of Matthew's about an outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it really isn't clear how this is good news. As one of my priest colleagues once remarked, it sounds like the kingdom of heaven is a trip to the dentist, going in for a root canal. And perhaps what makes parables like this so unsettling is that the punishment doesn't seem proportional to whatever offense there is. I'm sure we've all encountered the idea of final judgment, of hell as a place of punishment for the extremely wicked, and whatever our thoughts are on that, we can at least stomach that idea if we're thinking about it as a place reserved for those whose crimes against humanity and God were truly heinous. But in this parable, much like some of the others like it, the one who's being thrown into the outer darkness doesn't really seem to have done all that much wrong. In fact, I would even venture to say that in this case, this third slave may be the most sympathetic character in this whole parable. Though it sounds like he's been given little by comparison to the other two, the amount that he has been trusted with is actually enormous. The term talent as a measure of money is lost to us. But to anyone in Jesus' audience, this would be immediately understood as an enormous sum of money. No single individual would ever see a talent, except maybe kings and emperors. A talent would be more what you'd expect to find in the state coffers after everyone has paid their taxes. And here we have this slave who has been entrusted with this enormous sum. And it's not his. So it seems totally natural and fair that he might be just a little anxious about losing it. Knowing what we know about how volatile markets can be, can we really fault him for playing it safe? It isn't hard to imagine a scenario in which the first two lose it all, leaving only this one with anything at all to give back to the master. And in that scenario, wouldn't his actions seem not only understandable, but maybe even commendable and wise? I can't help but wonder what the outcome of this parable would have been if one or both of those other two lost everything. But Jesus doesn't give us this scenario. And perhaps that is itself a very significant point. Because while it may be that our understanding of this parable will impact the decisions that we make with our resources, including our money, At the end of the day, this parable is not really about market economies. Rather, it's about the economy of God's kingdom, which operates on an altogether different currency. A currency that we are reminded is untouched by moth or rust or flame. And that currency is a currency that always yields a return when it is invested. And that currency is none other than the very breath of life, God's own Spirit poured out on us as the very breath of our breathing. And the way in which we invest this gift is through love. And reflecting on this parable this week, I was reminded of a Jewish children's story that also, I think, illustrates a similar point. And it's a story about a soul of a person whose deeds on earth were so perfectly balanced between good and evil that upon his death, the angels have no idea what to do with him. Like, it's so balanced. We can't justify sending him to hell, and we can't justify sending him to heaven. So they go to God, what do we do? And God says, let him see both, and then let him decide. And so the soul is escorted to a banquet room, the likes of which he's never even imagined, filled with the finest food and drink, enough to feed the entire human population. This must surely be heaven, the soul thinks, as the dinner bell rings. But then in come the inhabitants, and all of them are emaciated and in anguish. And the soul begins to ponder, how can this be? And he notices something peculiar, that every one of these beings is missing elbows. And they come into this banquet feast, go to the table, start grabbing the food, trying desperately to get even a single morsel into their mouths, to no avail, crying in anguish. And the soul thinks, this is truly torture. This is hell. I've had enough. I can't take it. I don't want to see any more. Please, he says, please show me heaven. And so immediately he is taken into another banquet room. And this one is exactly like the one he's just left, down to every last detail. And once again, the dinner bell rings, and in come the inhabitants. And of course, he looks immediately, and sure enough, no elbows. What is this, he thinks? But they're not emaciated. They're full, and they're singing, and they're laughing, and there's joy. So what is this? What is this? The soul thinks. And then he watches as each one goes to the table, grabs a bite, and hands it to the one next to them, feeding one another. That's the difference. And much like this story, Jesus' parable may not be so much about the fate of our souls on the other side of the grave as it is about our lives on this side of the grave. I don't think anyone thinks that that story is suggesting that we will all end up with no elbows in the afterlife. Rather, it's a story about how do we bear faithful witness to the Spirit of God here. But while it may not be a parable about eternal damnation, there is a very real and dire warning in this parable for us today. Just as investing ourselves fully in love is guaranteed to yield dividends, so too, fear, when we allow ourselves to be ruled by it, can have a similar amplifying effect. If not kept in check, this understandable desire for self-preservation may begin to erode trust. It can lead to breakdown in conversation, in the growth of prejudice and suspicion of the other, eventually leading to hostility and violence. which in turn reinforces fears and prejudice in an ongoing vicious cycle. And as this vicious cycle escalates, the prospect of loving seems riskier and riskier. And it is risky. But the promise of the gospel is that the rewards are always worth the risk. And as risky as it is, or how it feels, to fully give of ourselves in love, the only true risk is to take no risk at all. Amen.